Gojira 1954 was a huge success. Toho had to capitalize on this and immediately started on this sequel, which still featured Takashi Shimura as scientist Dr. Yamane. Less than 6 months after Gojira was released, the sequel hit the screens. Godzilla Raids Again opens with a Godzilla roar, but not the familiar Ifukube theme, although to be fair, this was only the second film and therefore wasn't that familiar at this stage. It hadn't yet become the de facto soundtrack to the franchise. The film quickly establishes the romantic relationship between radio room operator Hidemi and Soichi Sukioka, one of 2 pilot friends who find themselves observing a monster brawl between Godzilla and an unidentified kaiju after one of them crashes their plane. Once reported, familiar-faced Dr. Yamane consults his flimsy tome in an effort to identify the battling monsters. The pilots find themselves using a dinosaur-book so they can identify the dinosaur they saw battling with Godzilla. And within seconds, it's concluded that the other dinosaur must be a radiated Ankylosaurus. There's no possibility of it being another dinosaur. Renowned paleontologist Dr. Yamane doesn't even float the idea that this might be a dinosaur we haven't yet discovered. This thin children's book seems to contain all dinosaurs that ever existed, and also documents their personalities. Ankylosaurus was apparently aggressive and hostile, despite being a herbivore. We now know that Ankylosaurus didn't even have spikes, but purely based on a pilot seeing it fleetingly behind a rock and then seeing a similar dinosaur in a book, we can categorically state that this is 100% definitely a radiated Ankylosaurus, and it shall be known as Anguirus. The scientists and politicians then have movie night and get some beers in and watch the original Gojira. Obviously, I'm being daft, but this is actually an odd scene because we get nearly 2 minutes of pretty much silent footage from the first film. It definitely reminds us of the amazing special effects from the first film, but other than a reminder to the audience of destructive potential, it serves no narrative purpose and seems awkwardly long. Yamane's bombshell that this is a different Godzilla to the one in the first film does not require the video to be played to the room. Yamane is a man with a plan though. Well, sort of. Watch the monsters to see where they strike and evacuate likely areas. That's his plan, which is sound. He also points out that Godzilla is sensitive to bright light and maybe that can be exploited, although his reasoning seems flawed. He reckons it's because it brings back bad memories of H-bomb testing. Surely, a more natural hypothesis would be that he's simply sensitive to bright lights like many other animals are. I'm surprised that's not in his children's encyclopedia of dinosaurs. I've made light of the dodgy science here, but the truth is that the film has done a really good job in establishing that we have 2 giant monsters capable of delivering immense destruction, and the solution in the first film is not available here. There are no effective countermeasures at our disposal. The fact that Dr. Serizawa perished along with his oxygen destroyer in the first film means that we have no means of dealing with Godzilla. So this can't be a rehash of the first film. We are left wondering what the hell they're gonna do. The sense of peril is high. Tracking Godzilla to see where he may emerge so that evacuation precautions can be made evokes that sense of panic from the first film. A dark feeling of foreboding lingers, and our romantic couple are part of that unease. Japanese society in the 1950s continued as it rebuilt after the war, but not far under the surface was a collective sense of fear. In Europe, the war left a residual concern over right-wing ideology. In Japan, however, unease was focused on the atomic threat. The normality of everyday life was revealed to be fragile next to the impact of nuclear violence. Atomic destruction didn't end with the H-bombs at the close of the war. News of various nuclear tests by America was very much part of daily conversation. The sense that people were waiting for something terrible to happen must have resonated with the national mood. During the Second World War, there were warnings issued over the radio followed by blackouts, and we see similar scenes here. When Godzilla himself emerges, it looks different from the last film, although this is a different Godzilla, remember. The neck looks longer, the suit looks much less bulky. Presumably this is to give the suitmation actor more movement. The Godzilla suit was made to fit actor Haruo Nakajima, who played Godzilla in the previous film also. The proportions of the body seem more human-like at times, which maybe looks more man in a suit and less monster-like. However, once out of the water, the suit looks much better, and the proportions more appealing. I don't know if it's just the surroundings, but I suspect there was perhaps a different suit used for the water scenes. It's clearly much slimmer. Before, Godzilla slowly stomped through Tokyo Bay, but in this film he will grapple with another monster, so the svelte proportions make that more achievable. As with Gojira, puppets are used for close-up headshots, and they look quite different from the suit heads. For a start, the neck is much shorter. When the film cuts from a wide shot to the hand puppet, the difference in the neck is quite obvious. It is scary though, less wonky than the 1954 version, and has a mouthful of jagged, almost shark-like teeth. Obviously, Godzilla isn't the only monster. Anguirus, however you want to pronounce his name, he's an interesting choice of monster. Instead of a Godzilla clone, is a quadruped covered in spikes. This contrast in shapes and abilities makes for a really interesting proposition, and it works really well. He isn't a humanoid shape, so straight away, he looks completely different. I do like the creative decisions around Anguirus, and the puppet head doesn't look too different from the suit head. Halfway through the film, we get the monster mash. Anguirus is sometimes forced onto two legs and looks more like a man in a suit, but the scenes are regularly cut with puppet heads too. The fighting does often look like two models or even two toys, but it never looks poor, and it always seems quite entertaining. Too often, though, it does look too fast and too frantic, and this can compromise the sense of huge scale. The speed does make it look more like animalistic behaviour, but it also risks making it look unintentionally funny. Crashes into the ground could be mistaken for pratfalls and monster-sized slapstick, which it isn't. We're meant to be scared, not laughing. The scenes of building destruction look much better in comparison. These scenes are slower paced, and as a result the destruction looks more realistic. It looks like terrifying carnage rather than models being bashed about. The battle here looks superb in terms of setting. If the action had been slower, then it would have looked amazing rather than just alright. The fantastic quality of the set design is compromised by that fast fighting style. The battle does have a major highlight though. The scene where Godzilla and Anguirus crash through Osaka Castle is one of my personal highlights of the film franchise. It's not just a new Godzilla in this film. Ishiro Honda was not available to direct, so Motoyoshi Oda sat in the director chair for this title. Although 6 months newer, this feels more dated. Not because of visual effects, it's just the overall style. This just looks more like a 50s film in terms of lighting and framing. Honda's vision felt very modern, and he captured life in a way that felt more real. Oda's style is more old-school Hollywood. The music in the film works. It's good, but it doesn't stand out. It feels a bit generic. Ifukabe's themes added so much, and they are certainly missed when they're not there. Thankfully, Eiji Tsuburaya was part of the production team. Gojira was an extravaganza of special effects. There's perhaps less work here for visual effects wizard Eiji Tsuburaya to do, but there's still plenty of miniature work. There's much more stock footage used in this film, along with matte paintings and projected images to create backdrops, but the miniatures are what really impress. There's a particularly great scene where a bunch of escaped criminals steal a truck, only to end up crashing it, causing an explosion. The transition of the scene from live action to models is so natural that you can hardly tell it's a model. Unlike other elements of the film, Tsuburaya's work does stand out. It elevates the overall look of the film. If it weren't for his talents, then this film would have felt like a low-budget cash-in. Tsuburaya's effects give this film the credibility it needs. The explosions and fires look fantastic. When we cut from actual footage to models, there is often no discernible difference in detail. The scenes of aftermath give the battles a real sense of consequence. As with Gojira, the importance of human characters and believable relationships is important for audience investment. A romance is the first thing established in the film, and later on we get a person's eye view of what's going on. Those escaped prisoners I mentioned earlier, they survive the crash and provide a superb eyes-on-the-ground perspective. We see them running around the evacuated city. It's a really clever narrative trick to add that human perspective. They run terrified of the destruction happening in the city. They're also part of another great example of Tsuburaya's creative genius. There's a set piece in the film that otherwise would have required a huge budget and hundreds of hours of set building if it had been full-sized. Godzilla Raids Again doesn't tackle the macro issues and ethics of 1954's Gojira, where Gojira was a truly terrifying reflection of how mankind must face up to its responsibilities of technical weaponization and exploited contemporary paranoia. This 1955 follow-up is less heavy on the politics, but the spectre of war still looms over this feature. There are mass evacuations and citywide blackouts, Scenes of evacuees running and carrying as many belongings as they can hold could come straight from a Pathé war film and must have resonated strongly with the Japanese public. Fear of atomic weaponry is expressed, and even the unthinkable is suggested, using hydrogen bombs against Godzilla. The fact that this suggestion is laced with a kind of guilt rather than bravado shows both the real-world attitudes towards nuclear weapons and the fear of Godzilla. This familiarity of war tinges the film with a terror the Godzilla series would rarely achieve again after the first two films. It still interweaves human stories into the film, and dealing with the local economic issues caused by destruction means that it's more than just a monster mash. Godzilla Raids Again never becomes mediocre, which is amazing considering it was rushed out. The directing and soundtrack are competent, they just don't stand out. Some creative choices, or mistakes if some reports are to be believed, around the frame rates used for some scenes lead to a weirdly executed film. The pace difference between the battles and close-ups of falling debris is jarring. The film successfully manages to include key elements that made the 1954 film a success, but at a lower intensity. There is engagement, but we're less invested in the characters. There's loss, but it's mainly economic rather than human loss. The sets are impressive, but compromised by strange frame rates. Special effects coordinator Eiji Tsuburaya carries the film and gives it a special magic which makes it more than watchable. It's a decent film, but restrictions of time, and perhaps talent, hold this back from being one of the great classics of the franchise.